Welcome to our TCC Round 6 Application Workbook tutorial. For information about navigating to the workbooks and downloading the templates, we recommend reviewing the Application Overview video on our website. Application workbooks are configured for Microsoft Excel and work best on the desktop application. Applicants who complete the workbooks in other applications, such as Google Sheets, may experience errors with the formulas and formatting. Workbooks are a key component of the TCC application and may require significant time to complete. Workbooks, consisting primarily of a work plan and budget, are how reviewers will understand how you will spend your TCC funds and what work you will complete. A reviewer should be able to review your workbook and have a thorough understanding of your proposal. First, we'll go over some key terms and definitions. A lead applicant is an entity that enters a partnership with other organizations for the purpose of applying for a TCC grant and has been designated as the lead organization for the partnership. Each grant application will have only one lead applicant. Project and plan leads, which is only for implementation grants. The lead applicant or co-applicant responsible for leading the implementation of a specific project or plan. Tribal applicants are applicants whose lead applicant is a California Native American tribe or tribally owned nonprofit, as defined in the TCC guidelines. Indirect costs are expenses of doing business that are of a general nature, which are not costs directly tied to the grant, but are necessary for the general operation of the organization. Indirect costs may include, but are not limited to, personnel costs of administrative, supervisory, legal, and executive and clerical support staff, and operating expenses and equipment costs not included as part of direct project costs for functions such as accounting, business services, janitorial, rent, utilities, supplies, etc. Applicants may include indirect costs in their budget at a rate of up to 15% of direct costs, excluding capital costs and equipment purchases with a per unit cost of $5,000 or more. Tribal applicants may use a higher indirect cost rate. SGC will accept a current federally negotiated rate, or if a tribe does not have one, they may request a modification to use a rate higher than 15%. This process is outlined in the application instructions. Indirect cost rates are calculated based on direct costs using the percentage you specify. Contingency is funding that is allocated in anticipation of having unexpected costs. Contingency is only required for implementation grants, where contingency must be between 5 and 10% of each project, plan, and grantee costs budget. Contingency is optional for planning and project development grant applicants, who may include up to 10% contingency in their budget. Leverage funds, which only apply to implementation grants, mean that applicants must secure additional funding equal to 50% of the total requested grant amount. At the time of application, this can include funds that are committed as well as possible additional sources that have been identified but not yet committed. By the end of the 9-month pre-development phase, all 50% must be committed so that the applicant can meet this requirement and move on to the implementation phase. Tribal applicants are exempt from leverage funding requirements. Applicants who are eligible for the Disadvantaged Unincorporated Community Funding Goal must secure only 25% leverage funding instead of 50%. See Section 7.7 of the TCC Guidelines for more information on leverage funding requirements and eligibility. Capital costs are costs associated with construction or acquisition of capital improvements and infrastructure. First, we will go over the workbook template that you will use for a planning grant or a project development grant. The two workbooks are almost identical, so we will just be going over a project development grant workbook in this video. If you are applying for an implementation grant, you can skip ahead to the implementation grant section using the video chapters. We will go over each sheet in the project development grant workbook. Sheet 0, which says Read Me, has instructions and tips for how to complete the rest of the sheets. We strongly suggest you read this sheet before beginning, then look at all of the other sheets to understand what you'll need to do, and then complete the sheets in order. All applicants must complete sheets 1 through 4, plus a co-applicant budget sheet for each co-applicant organization to capture their budget request. If you have more co-applicants than there are spaces available, please email TCC. When you save this workbook, please follow the naming convention listed here. There is a sample workbook for your reference at the link in cell C16. This sample is only a demonstration of how to fill out a workbook. The content of the workbook is not meant to represent a feasible or competitive application. The workbook contains color-coded cells to indicate what type of information is in the cell. You can refer back to the legend on this sheet. Only edit the white cells within each sheet of the workbook. Editing any other cells can affect the formulas or formatting. Gray shaded cells have formulas or instructions which are locked from editing. Yellow cells have descriptions of terms and phrases used in table headers, and blue shaded cells are headers. The rest of this sheet contains tips and instructions for each sheet with helpful links at the bottom. Now we'll go through each of the sheets in order. In Sheet 1, Applicant and Grant Info, you will provide basic information about the grant proposal. Insert the name of your grant proposal, then a brief description of the proposal, noting the character limit. If you are committing any leverage funds to this project, including in-kind donations, insert that amount here. Leverage funds are not required for planning grants and project development grants. Then insert the total grant funds requested. This amount must eventually match the total TCC funds requested box in cell E2 of Sheet 2. Then identify each of your co-applicants and enter their organization type. This is an example of a completed applicant and grant info sheet. Sheet 2, the budget summary, provides an overview of the budget request and of each partner's funding allocation. The summary of costs table will start at $0, but as you complete sheets 4 and beyond, it will auto-populate with values based on preset formulas. As sheet 0 instructs, the only entry you must make on this sheet is entering your indirect cost rate in cell C4. If different lead and co-applicants require different indirect rates, please input the highest of those rates on this page. This ensures your budget includes adequate funds for indirect costs. If awarded, you will have an opportunity during the post-award consultation phase to reallocate any excess indirect funds to other budget items. If you are choosing to include contingency in your budget, put a percentage of 10% or less in cell C5. You may complete these two cells at any time before submission, but be aware that changing these numbers will change the total TCC funds requested. If you'd like to calculate a precise contingency rate to request, you may use the table at the bottom of this sheet. Enter your target requested TCC funds, which is up to $5 million for project development grants and $300,000 for planning grants. Then look at the contingency needed cell to see the percentage you should enter into C5 to meet your target. If you use this table, entering a contingency percentage in C5 should be your very last step in the workbook, since any adjustments to the following budget sheets will change the calculation for contingency needed. Next, we'll move on to the work plan sheet. The work plan is a set of tasks that align with program objectives and collectively work to achieve the goals of the grant proposal. Complete this work plan sheet before beginning work on the following budget sheets. The tasks you include here will inform how you complete your budget. Provide sufficient description of the tasks and subtasks to provide reviewers with an understanding of how the objectives and goals will be achieved. Tasks are the activities that contribute to the vision statement and overall goal of the grant. Each major activity should be its own task with its own outcome. Subtasks are the steps or activities needed to accomplish the task. For each task, insert a task name in the white box. We recommend that your first task is grant administration, partner coordination, and reporting. Provide subtask descriptions with the specific actions needed to complete a deliverable or milestone. For each subtask, input at least one deliverable or milestone. A deliverable is documentation that the subtask has been completed. For a subtask of securing an office, the deliverable could be a signed lease agreement. A milestone, on the other hand, is a key event that indicates specified progress towards the task, but may not have tangible documentation to submit to TCC. For example, for a feasibility study subtask, a milestone could be when the study is 50% complete. The final deliverable would be the completed study. List one responsible party for each subtask, which is the lead or co-applicant organization that will be responsible for completing that subtask. If a subcontractor will be completing the activity, write subcontractor hired by and the name of the appropriate lead or co-applicant. For each subtask, insert the approximate month or range of months after grant execution when the subtask will be completed. Use the designation of month and then the month number. For example, if your grant term is projected to begin in January and a subtask is scheduled to take place from March to June, the timeline column would be months 3 to 6. Since we don't know the exact month when the grant agreement will be executed, using numbers instead of month names means fewer changes and edits will be needed later. As a reminder, the planning grant and project development grant term is 2 years or 24 months. The earliest a task can start is month 1, and the latest it can end is month 24. The work plan offers space for 10 tasks. You can add rows within a table for more subtasks, and you can copy and paste the task table below task 10 if you'd like to add more tasks. We will note a couple of key differences between the planning grant and project development grant requirements, since they use a similar workbook but adhere to different requirements. First, planning grants require at least one co-applicant, and TCC strongly encourages including more than one. Project development grants require at least 2 applicants, again, strongly encouraged to include more. For planning grants, capital and equipment costs are ineligible, and for project development grants, equipment costs may be included. Equipment costs are not eligible, but capital costs may be included if they are part of pilot or demonstration projects. Moving on to sheet 4, each lead and co-applicant must itemize all of their costs associated with the grant activities. Applicants will fill out their detailed budget in Table A, with co-applicants filling out their budgets in the following tabs. The Summary of Cost Categories table provides a description of each category and will automatically tabulate each total based on the applicant's selection in Table A. When completing the budget, allocate adequate funds to cover raises, promotions, future hires, and professional development opportunities for all personnel and staff funded by this grant for the entire grant term. Be sure to include benefits and any other costs associated with employment, either combined in a single line item with the wages or as separate line items. Please refer to Section 8.1 of the TCC Guidelines for more information on eligible costs. If you anticipate any of these costs increasing, such as salaries or benefits such as healthcare, you will need to overestimate the current rates to account for those future increases. For each task in the work plan, itemize all the respective costs in each row. You may change the task numbers to correspond to your itemization. If you need additional rows, select rows 32 to 64, then right-click and select Unhide Rows. For each line item, select a cost category using the drop-down. The cost categories are personnel, subcontractors, participant compensation, other community engagement costs, materials/supplies, travel, and other direct costs. If you select other direct costs, ensure that your cost description provides a clear description for the use of funds. Only use this category if the item does not fit into any of the other categories. For personnel, cost descriptions should clearly identify the position titles of each personnel member. If an employee will work part-time on the grant, indicate the unit as percent of FTE, such as 0.5. The unit type will be employees. Alternatively, use an hourly rate and select the unit hours. Input the cost per unit and the number of units, and select a unit type using the drop-down menu. If the unit type is other, please indicate the unit cost in the cost description. If you are committing any leverage funds for this cost, put that amount in column H. This includes in-kind contributions such as staff time that won't be billed to TCC. Leverage funds are not required or expected for planning and project development grants, but if you are committing leverage funds in your application, you must document them in this budget. The total cost of the line item will be automatically tabulated in column I, with the total request of TCC grant funds for that line item in column J. If you have no leverage funds, these two numbers will be the same. For project development grants only, use Table B to itemize any capital costs associated with pilot or demonstration projects. Do not include these costs in Table A, and ensure the cost is not double counted in any co-applicant budget sheets. For each capital cost, identify the associated task number, enter a brief description of the cost, identify the total cost, and identify any leverage funds that will be used for the line item. The table will automatically tabulate all of the amounts for the capital costs to be excluded from the indirect cost calculation in the budget summary sheet. Next, we will review the co-applicant sheets. Costs from the lead applicant sheet and all co-applicant sheets will automatically populate in the budget summary sheet we went over earlier. For all the co-applicant sheets, the format of the page is the same as the lead applicant sheet. Follow the same process for entering in costs. The name of the co-applicant will automatically populate at the top of the sheet once you enter it in sheet 1. Double check that you are entering the budget for the correct co-applicant. You may rename the sheet for ease of navigating by double-clicking. When you are done, review sheets 1 and 2 again to ensure that all budget numbers are correct. If you are applying for a planning grant or a project development grant, you can disregard the rest of this video. Please email us at tcc@sgc.ca.gov or join our office hours if you have any questions. Next, we'll discuss the implementation grant application workbooks. First, we'll go over project workbooks, then the grantee workbook and the summary workbook. There are also 2 workbooks that we will not be going over. Those are the standalone leverage workbook, which is a simplified version of the project workbooks. The second is the transformative plan workbooks, which are very similar to the project workbooks. We'll briefly touch on the differences after reviewing the project workbooks in detail. Implementation grant applicants will propose projects that fall under strategies. All 13 strategies are detailed in the guidelines in Appendix B, where you can find applicant and application requirements, eligible costs, and pre-development requirements. As you select projects and strategies, use the TCC guidelines to inform your strategy selection and project development. As a reminder, each implementation grant applicant must include at least 3 strategies and have at least 1 project for each chosen strategy. At least 1 project must directly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and all selected projects must be completed within the 4-year implementation phase. Each strategy has a corresponding project workbook template, which can be found in the appropriate folders in the Round 6 application Google Drive. The exception is Strategy 1, for which applicants are required to use the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program Application Workbook. There are further instructions and a link to the workbook on Submittable. For implementation grants, your workbook will include a work plan and detailed budget for your pre-development phase activities, and a work plan and budget overview for your implementation phase activities. During the pre-development phase, you will develop a detailed budget and refined work plan for the implementation phase. During the post-award consultation phase, after awards are announced, you will also have an opportunity to lightly refine your pre-development phase work plan and budget. Sheet 0, which says README, has instructions and tips for how to complete the rest of the sheets. We strongly suggest you read this sheet before beginning. Then look at all of the sheets to understand what you'll need to do, and then complete the sheets in order. When you save this workbook, please follow the naming convention listed here. There is a sample workbook for your reference at the link in cell C15. This sample is only a demonstration of how to fill out a workbook. The content of the workbook is not meant to represent a feasible or competitive application. There must be a workbook filled out for every project you include in your application. If you have multiple projects under one strategy, you must complete a workbook for each of those projects. There are 5 required sheets that the project lead must complete. The rest of this sheet contains tips and information for each sheet with helpful links at the bottom. This workbook contains color-coded cells to indicate the following information. You can refer back to the legend on this sheet. Applicants shall only edit the white cells within each sheet of the workbook. Editing any other cells can affect the formulas or formatting. Gray cells have formulas or instructions which are locked from editing. Yellow cells have descriptions of terms and phrases used in table headers. Blue cells are headers, and green and red shaded cells with red or green text have conditional formatting that indicates whether calculation checks found a discrepancy, red, or are correct, green. Now we'll go through each of the sheets in order. The applicant and project info sheet will be where the project lead will provide a description of the project and other high-level details. Before you begin, confirm that the strategy listed is the correct strategy you've chosen. If it is not, you'll need to download a different workbook before you begin. Enter your project name. Provide a brief overview of the goals, deliverables, outcomes, and tasks that are envisioned for this project. Note the 800-character limit and the character count below. In the leverage funds box, enter the total leverage funding designated for this project. If there are no leveraged funds, put 0. In the project funds requested box, enter the total TCC dollars requested for this project. These 2 boxes must match the details you enter into sheets 3 and 4. You can complete these 2 boxes at the end if you prefer. Then identify the lead applicant of the entire grant application. Also identify the project or plan lead of this project, which may be the lead applicant or any co-applicant. Here is an example of a completed sheet 1. Next, we'll move on to sheet 2, the budget summary. The budget summary provides an overview of the budget request, sum totals by cost categories, as well as the pre-development versus implementation phase funding allocation. You will only fill out 2 cells in this sheet, C4 and C5. The values on this sheet will all start at $0, but as you complete sheets 3 and 4, the values will auto-populate based on preset formulas. There is conditional formatting to indicate whether cost caps and minimums have been met or exceeded. In cell C4, enter your indirect cost rate. If there are multiple co-applicants involved in this project and they will have different indirect rates, please input the highest of those rates on this page. This ensures your budget includes adequate funds for indirect costs. If awarded, you will have an opportunity during the pre-development phase to reallocate any excess indirect funds to other budget items. In cell C5, enter your contingency rate. If you do not enter percentages in these cells, the workbook will use a default of 15% for indirect and 10% for contingency. During the pre-development phase, both indirect and contingency values will be refined. If in doubt, we recommend overestimating indirect and contingency at this stage, as SGC cannot provide any additional funds down the road to cover a shortfall. Here is an example of a completed workbook. If at the end of filling out your workbook, the total TCC funds requested in H12 is different from what you entered in Sheet 1, you will need to adjust your indirect percentage, your contingency percentage, or your total requested funds in Sheet 1. Do not change any formulas. Next, we'll move on to the work plan and budget. A work plan is a set of tasks that align with program objectives and collectively work to complete the grant activities. There is one work plan for the pre-development phase and one for the implementation phase, both within Sheet 3, Work Plan and Budget. The work plans should provide a sufficient description of the tasks to provide reviewers with an understanding of how specific task activities advance the objectives and goals. A funded pre-development phase is a new feature of implementation grants this round. Applicants can finalize design plans, secure permits, and complete the pre-development requirements for up to 9 months after the beginning of the grant. During the pre-development phase, no implementation work may occur. The only eligible activities are pre-development activities, such as completing all pre-development requirements, conducting any other preparation work necessary to reach a shovel-ready state for the implementation grant phase. All of the tasks you will do during these 9 months should be identified here in the pre-development phase work plan. For each pre-development requirement that you have not already completed, there must be a corresponding subtask. For each subtask, provide a description of the activity that needs to be completed. You can find the pre-development requirements in column G of Sheet 5. For each subtask, identify at least one deliverable and/or milestone. A deliverable is documentation that the subtask has been completed. For a subtask that is securing an office, the deliverable could be a signed lease agreement. A milestone, on the other hand, is a key event that indicates specified progress towards the task, but may not have tangible documentation to submit to TCC. For example, for a feasibility study, the milestones could be when the study is 50% complete. The final deliverable would be the completed study. Here is an example of a completed pre-development phase work plan. List the responsible party for each subtask, which is the organization that will be responsible for completing the subtask. If a subcontractor will be completing the activity, write subcontractor hired by and the name of the appropriate lead or co-applicant. For each subtask, insert the approximate month or range of months after grant execution when the subtask will be completed. Use the designation of month and then the month number. For example, if your grant term is projected to begin in January and a subtask is scheduled to take place from March to June, the timeline column would be months 3 to 6. Since we don't know the exact month when the grant agreement will be executed, using month numbers instead of names means fewer changes will be needed later. All pre-development phase deliverables should be completed in months 1 to 9. However, your staff time for tasks related to grant administration, coordination, preparing for the implementation phase, etc., should have a budget that covers months 1 to 12, the whole first year of the grant, so that you are also covering the administrative transition to the implementation phase, which could last up to 3 months. Insert additional rows for additional subtasks if necessary. After completing the table, you will see the word stop. This serves to remind you to pause your work on this sheet, even though it continues below, and instead navigate to Sheet 4 to complete the pre-development detailed budget. Sheet 4, the pre-development phase budget, will capture itemized costs of staff time and any other direct costs associated with completing the pre-development tasks. For each line item, you must select a cost category from the dropdown. If you do not select a cost category, the budget summary will not tabulate the costs correctly. The cost categories are personnel, subcontractors, participant compensation, other community engagement costs, materials and supplies, travel, and other direct costs. For descriptions of each category, refer to the summary table at the top. The Summary of Cost Categories table will automatically tabulate funds as line items of each category are added. If you select Other Direct Costs, ensure that your cost description provides a clear description for the use of funds. Only use this cost category if the item does not fit in the other categories. In the Cost Description column, provide a description of the specific cost. After that, enter the cost per unit in column D, which should be based on the best estimate. If there is only one unit for the cost, such as hiring one subcontractor for a specific scope, enter the amount as a lump sum cost. If any units are funded by leverage, include their cost as well. In column E, enter the number of units to be purchased. If any units are funded by leverage, include those in the total amount. For example, let's say a cost was to purchase 10 laptops and 3 were funded by leverage funds. The number 10 would still be listed here and not 7, despite the 7 being funded by TCC funds. In column F, select the type of unit type from the cost drop-down menu. There are 8 types of costs and an additional other category. If you select Other, write a detailed description of what the unit type is in the cost description column. If there are any leverage funds being used in this cost, insert the total amount of leverage funds in column G. The total cost of the line item will be automatically tabulated in column H, with the total request for TCC grant funds in column I. For personnel, cost descriptions should clearly identify the organization and position titles of each personnel member. If an employee will work part-time on the grant, include the unit as percent of FTE, such as 0.5. The unit type will be employees. Alternatively, use an hourly rate and select the unit hours. Input the cost per unit and the number of units, and select a unit type using the drop-down menu. If you need additional rows, select rows 35 to 60, right-click, and click on Hide Rows, or 34 to 60. From here, return to Sheet 3, Work Plan and Budget, to continue completing the Implementation Phase Work Plan and Budget Overview. On Sheet 3, scroll down to the table titled Implementation Phase Work Plan. Each major component of the project should be its own task with multiple subtasks. Complete subtasks the same way you did for the pre-development phase. Each subtask will have a description, deliverable or milestone, responsible party, and timeline. Rather than a single task like the pre-development phase, the implementation phase work plan has space for up to 10 tasks. If your project has more than 10 tasks, you can copy and paste additional tasks below task 10. Email TCC if you need assistance. In addition, for each task, you must input a task name. We recommend that a title that is brief and summarizes the goal or objective of the task. We suggest that the first task be grant administration to establish the project lead's project management, invoicing, and reporting responsibilities. Implementation phase tasks should occur between months 12 and months 60 and can also utilize quarters and/or years to indicate activities that may occur much later in the grant term. For example, month 31 could be written as quarter 3 of year 3. Do not put any pre-development activities or costs in the implementation phase work plan tables, as these should have been captured in the work plan above and in the pre-development detailed budget sheets. As you complete the work plan for each task, scroll to the right to see the budget overview table that you will need to complete for each task. The preview of requested costs table at the top will tabulate the totals for the tasks as you complete the budget overviews for each task. To complete the budget overview tables, identify the total costs associated with each category per task, not subtasks, in the TCC budget allocation column. These will help to provide a high-level budget overview for all costs within the implementation phase. Any costs that do not fall into a listed cost category should be included in the Other Direct Costs row. These other direct costs require a description in the optional notes / description column and should only be used if the cost truly doesn't fit into any of the other categories. Do not add any rows to these tables, since the rows do not correspond to the subtasks to the left, but rather to the entire task table. Here's an example of some completed tables. You do not need a detailed line item budget for implementation phase tasks. You only need these totals per category. During the pre-development phase, you will take these tables and turn them into detailed line item budgets before you proceed to the implementation phase. If you have any leverage funds that have been identified or committed to the implementation phase tasks, enter those into the leverage / in-kind column. The sum of all leverage funding across the implementation and pre-development phase must match the leverage funding identified for the project in the leverage funding worksheet within the summary budget workbook, which we will discuss soon. After completing sheets 3 and 4, check sheet 2, budget summary, for accuracy and double check to make sure you haven't exceeded any cost caps. Then navigate back to sheet 1, applicant and project info, to ensure that the TCC funds requested match the amounts in cell H12 of the sheet 2 budget summary. Moving on to sheet 5. Sheet 5 is where you will report on your progress towards all application requirements and pre-development requirements for this project. As a reminder, each strategy, except for strategy 1, has this strategy requirements sheet that must be completed. All application requirements must be completed by the time of application in order for the applicant to be eligible for funding. Pre-development requirements must be completed by the end of the pre-development phase in order to receive implementation funding. If you have already completed or made progress towards pre-development requirements, you should report that progress as it will improve your score. Column A describes each of the requirements, which may have both an application requirement component and a pre-development requirement component. Those are in columns F and G in blue and green. Column F describes the application requirement or threshold criteria, and column C details the format of how you will submit that application requirement if applicable. To confirm that you have met an application requirement and provided the required material in the correct format, use the drop-down in column D to select Acknowledged and Completed to attest that you understand the requirement and have completed it. You must complete all application requirements for your project to be eligible. You may use column E to provide any relevant notes or context related to the status of the requirement. By default, once you select Acknowledged and Completed, column E will populate with NA. You may overwrite NA to provide a description, but it is not required. This is an example of a completed table with all items marked Acknowledged and Completed. Scrolling right to the pre-development requirements, read the requirements in column G. And then in column H, use the drop-down menu to select the status of that pre-development requirement. You will select Not Started, In Progress, or Complete. In column I, enter the anticipated month that requirement will be met during the pre-development phase. This should be a month from 1 to 9 and should correspond to the month you wrote on your pre-development phase work plan. If you have already completed the requirement, you can write complete or NA or leave it blank. In column J, describe any progress you've made towards the pre-development requirement. If you marked in progress or not yet started, describe the detailed next steps you will take during the pre-development phase to meet the requirement. You should provide more detail than you did in the corresponding subtask in the pre-development phase work plan. If you marked complete, write a brief description of how you have met the requirement and any other information that would be useful for an application reviewer to know. Finally, upload the corresponding documentation for all application requirements and any pre-development requirements you've made progress on using the appropriate strategy form in Submittable. Progress towards pre-development requirements will be favorably considered in the project feasibility scoring section, so be sure to upload the optional documentation of any pre-development requirements you have completed or made progress on. You will also need to complete 3 transformative plan workbooks. The steps and process of completing the transformative plan workbooks is nearly identical to the project workbooks. The only major difference is that there is no sheet 5, as there are no pre-development requirements besides creating a detailed work plan and budget for the implementation phase. Next, we will move on to another workbook, the Grantee Costs Workbook. We will go over this workbook in less detail than the project workbook as the structure and instructions are similar. The major difference is that instead of a strategy requirements sheet, Sheet 5 is the threshold application requirements section that the lead applicant is responsible for. This workbook is to capture the lead applicant's grant management and coordination responsibilities, such as the recommended annual strategic planning day for all lead and co-applicants, and submitting, invoicing, and reporting on behalf of all co-applicants to SGC. Activities in this workbook should not be tied to any specific project or plan and should be specific to grant administration. Applicants should dedicate at least 2 full-time staff members or the equivalent exclusively to grant management. This workbook will be where that information and budget lives. In Sheet 1, enter the name of the lead applicant organization and the grant proposal name. Next, describe the overall approach to grant management. This includes support to co-applicants, coordination, reporting, and general oversight. Identify the dollar amounts for leverage funds and requested TCC funds below. Include any in-kind donations of staff time in the leverage funds amount. Sheet 2, the budget summary, is the same as in the project workbooks. In Sheet 3, as in the project workbooks, there is a pre-development phase work plan, where applicants will list all the subtasks related to completing the pre-development requirements. Again, this should include months 1 to 12 for staff time. You should also include any activities needed to support your co-applicants through the pre-development phase, such as project management and coordination. Grant administration will include the 3-month transition period before beginning the implementation phase, so the grant admin line item may be from months 1 to 12. Complete the pre-development phase work plan, then the pre-development detailed budget on Sheet 4, then return to Sheet 3 to complete the implementation phase work plan down below. Complete this work plan the same way as for the project workbook, except the timeline may be from months 12 to 72 because of the final year of the evaluation phase in which the lead grantee will still have grant management responsibilities. Tab 5, Thresholds. You must meet all threshold requirements and application requirements to be considered for award. Indicate the status of each requirement using the drop-down in D. There are also a few pre-development requirements that may be submitted at application if you have them ready. When you have completed all the sheets, Navigate back to Sheet 2, Budget Summary, to confirm that the amounts match what you entered on Sheet 1 and that all costs are within cost caps. Finally, we'll go over the Summary Workbook, which consolidates all the information from the individual workbooks for an overview of the entire grant request. The Leverage Funding Worksheet is also housed within this workbook. The lead applicant is responsible for completing this workbook. Fill out the proposal summary table first. The information in this table will auto-populate the later sheets in this workbook, so please fill it out accurately. Provide each project's name, identify each project or plan lead, paste the project or plan summary from each individual workbook, and put the contact information for a contact person from each organization. Note that you will not need to provide unique names for the transformative plans, only for projects, including leverage projects. For leverage projects, we recommend denoting the title of the project after the term leverage project. For example, leverage project, succulent garden planting. In the applicant summary tab, enter the name of each lead and co-applicant, including those leading leverage projects. Select an entity type from the drop-down menu. If the entity is in the other category, please indicate what type of entity the co-applicant is in the next column. Add additional rows as needed. Next, we'll discuss the leverage funding worksheet. This is a key threshold requirement, as most implementation grant applicants are required to identify at least 50% of the TCC requested funding amount in leverage funds. On this worksheet, applicants can enter their potential and/or committed funding sources and the amounts. Tribes are exempt from the leverage funding requirement, and applicants eligible for the disadvantaged unincorporated community funding goal must identify leverage funds totaling at least 25% of their TCC funding instead of 50%. Leverage funding does not need to be committed at application in round 6. Applicants must identify all potential sources, whether the funds have been committed to their proposed use, and the amount of funding they anticipate securing during the 9-month pre-development phase. Identify whether each funding source is for a standalone leverage project, meaning the project will be completed without any TCC funds. Standalone leverage projects may count for up to half of the leverage requirement. For committed funds, indicate the beginning date and end date of the funding term. For funds that have not been committed, write the anticipated funding term start date, describe the steps that remain to secure the funding, and describe the likelihood of securing the funds during the pre-development phase. If the leverage funding was spent in the year prior to the TCC grant application, confirm that the funding is aligned with the program objectives and community vision, results from a community planning process that led to this application, and that meaningful community engagement occurred. Applicants who have committed leverage funds at application should provide supporting documents for each secured funding source to be favorably considered when scoring. You can provide supporting documentation for leverage funding on Submittable, and you can refer to a template letter in Google Drive. You may add additional rows as needed. You may exceed the minimum required amount of leverage funds. The total of this table must be equal to at least 50% or 25%, depending on the applicant type, of the requested TCC funds. To correctly complete this table and meet this important threshold requirement, please make sure you have carefully reviewed Section 7.7 of the TCC guidelines. Finally, the summary budget. This sheet is a composite of all the budgets that have been designated across all grant components, including grantee costs, plans, projects, and leverage-only projects. This is a record of the whole grant proposal in one place. For grantee costs and each project and plan, insert the percentages of pre-development costs, direct costs, indirect rates, and contingency percentages from the respective workbooks. The instructions are listed at the top of this sheet. The main things to point out are that white cells are the only ones to be edited. Cells that are shaded typically contain formulas or formatting to help tabulate and collect the information. Do not change any of this formatting, as doing so may lead to the formulas breaking. The leverage amount will come from the leverage funding sources sheet, and the TCC grant funds will be calculated based on the entered costs in columns G through K. You may also unhide for additional rows for additional projects. For leverage-only projects, you will only need to indicate the total funding amount for each project. For water supply and wastewater infrastructure, there is no corresponding workbook. The cost cap for most applicants is 10% and up to 25% for tribal applicants. Grants that utilize TCC funds for water and wastewater infrastructure must identify the allocation of pre-development and implementation phase funds, indirect and contingency percentages, and provide a description for what the funds will be used for. Lead applicants are responsible for ensuring that the values listed for each project and plan match the totals in their respective Excel workbooks. When you have completed the workbooks, you will upload them to the appropriate locations on Submittable and submit your application. As a reminder, workbooks and all other application materials are due September 30th via Submittable. Applications are not accepted in any other formats. This is all the content we have for this webinar. There are additional resources listed on our Round 6 webpage on the TCC website. Please email tcc@sgc.ca.gov if you have questions or need additional information.